guys, one of the things I've learned in life after all these years, 60 years, is that it's not the painful memories that are bad, it's the good memories. So when you look back on time, the bad stuff, yeah, you can kind of push out of your mind, oh, that's a horrible time, I'm glad that's over. But what's really painful, you will find, is when you get older and you look back at the good times, because you know it's never coming back. It's sort of nostalgia. Nostalgia is bittersweet. You had a great time then, but you know that it's over. You can't go back because time just moves one way. And I thought of that in the sense we're going through that in America. A lot of the older people were living through nostalgia, looking back at a time that no longer exists, but we want it to exist. And you see it with some politicians like Mike Pence. With Mike Pence, and I understand what he's doing, is perpetually 1985, because that was a great time for someone of that era. And I understand it because Mike Pence is just 4 years older than me. He graduated high school in the late 70s, and by the mid 80s, he graduated college and he went into law, the whole bit. And I was a little later. I graduated high school in 1981, and then I graduated college in 1985. But I understand, because that kind of defines your worldview, and you want the America you knew then to perpetually continue. And that influences everything. And that's why you see Mike Pence, he just seems out of time, because he is. The America in the 1980s no longer exists. Those people, for the most part, are gone. And it's sad, it's very painful. But I thought of this when it came to, there's been rumblings that we may need a draft, a military draft. I mean, there's just rumblings now, but the United States Army, they're not meeting their recruitment goals. And there's like, oh, if we get in a war with Russia or China, we'll need a draft. And everyone just sort of assumes that that would still work, because we did that in World War II. And then immediately after World War II, there was a huge fight with Korea. There was a draft there. And then I believe it was in 1965, they started the draft again for Vietnam. And you have to understand people, their mindsets at the time. So let's say if you were 20 years old in 1965, that means you're just like the start of the boomer age, because 1945, the baby boom happened after World War II. So you're 20 years old, you're getting drafted to go to Vietnam in 1965, but your whole upbringing is so alien from what it is now. When you were raised as a kid, you would have been defined in the late 50s, went to high school in the late 50s, early 60s. This was a 90% white country. And we say that, but it was actually more than 90% in practical terms, because that included certain areas, especially the South, were heavily black. And there were basically only two races in the United States, two ethnic groups, whites and blacks. There hardly was anyone else here, because we had strict immigration. And most of the blacks stayed in their own areas. So literally in much of the country, like if you lived in Oregon or Washington or Minnesota, you could literally go all year without seeing a black. That wouldn't have been unusual. So this was pretty much a white country. And I kind of remember this. When I went to school, I went to an all-white school. By the time I got to high school, we had maybe one black in the school, maybe a couple of Hispanics, but they just assimilated in. So it was a different time. So you have this person, this hypothetical person, in 1965 to be drafted. He was raised in a homogenous country. It was white and it was Christian. Not everyone, you had different denominations, so maybe people didn't really believe sometimes, but you know, everyone celebrated Christmas. Most people went to church. Again, even if you didn't believe, people went to church. It was part of the community, and it was a common culture, and people would watch like Gunsmoke and shows like that you could still see on reruns. And everything was really positive about being an American. It wasn't trying to tear people down. It's like, you should feel good. I mean, we beat the evil Nazis and we're the greatest nation, and you know, we're headed to the moon soon. We got the space age. It was a time that was very optimistic for people, and there was a high trust in the United States government. Like, oh yeah, there's political disputes, but we always felt that our government didn't hate us. They were our representatives. We may have disagreements with them, but we're always willing to chip in to help the nation. So the guy that was 20 years old then in 1965, he probably had his father or his uncle fought in World War II or Korea, and it was a proud moment. So of course, he's the majority of people at that age then, okay, yeah, I'll help my country in Vietnam to stop the commie bastards from taking over the world. And it was interesting because by the time that all finished, the draft ended about 1972 was the last year it ended, and the world had totally changed. It went through like a cultural revolution. So when he started in 1965 watching shows about Gunsmoke and a real cohesive community, by the early 70s you had people like Norman Lear running things in Hollywood with All in the Family and attacking Western civilization. You have feminism, an explosion in pornography, divorce became common, totally radical change. And the society they didn't have the trust that much anymore in the government. So the draft, there was a lot of protests against the draft, like, why should I die in the jungles of Vietnam? How's this benefiting America? And it just fell apart. And I remember in the 70s, there was a lot of anti-war stuff. You had TV shows like MASH, and it was not cool to be part of the military. If you were in the military, that was embarrassing. You didn't want to be part of it. In universities that I attended in the early 1980s, they wouldn't even allow recruiters to come onto campus. It's like, no, we don't want your war machine here. Or if you're part of the CIA or FBI, no, you can't recruit on campus. How times have changed. So that was the dynamic. But by the time we got into the 80s, things started to change because Reagan, he brought back pride in America, and it was an all-volunteer army then. And so it had a different sense because a different generation was coming in. They cut their hair, the hippies were out, people were about making money in the 80s, greed is good. And then you had movies like Top Gun, Tom Cruise, and it showed being in the military was kind of cool. And that set a new tone. And this is like where Mike Pence is from. And so everything was pretty good then until then in 1991, we had Desert Storm. And that was an easy victory over Iraq. You remember they invaded Kuwait. And it became our first video game war where we could kill these stupid Muslims. They didn't know how to fight. Let's stick it to Muhammad. And they would show all these cool footage of our aircraft just blowing the shit out of them. And it was a turkey shoot. It really wasn't a war. It was like a slaughter. They couldn't fight back. They were very primitive and they mostly surrendered. And we were like, hoorah! And they got everyone really excited about that. And so the respect of the military was really high then in the 80s and 90s. And then it probably peaked in 2001 because of the terrorist attack, September 11th. Everyone, flags were everywhere. People were patriotic. People were joining the military because they wanted to fight international terrorism and defend America. I remember that time very well. I can't believe it's over 20 years ago. And then we got into Afghanistan to catch Osama bin Laden, supposedly. And we started the Iraq War in what was that? In 2003, the Iraq War. Because supposedly Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. That turned out to be bullshit. And that was an easy war too. They couldn't really fight us. It was another turkey shoot where we had very few casualties. But then things started to go south again. And what happened is the Iraq War kind of is an easy victory at first, but the occupation became difficult and we started to get terrorists and ISIS was formed. And then we're like, well, what the hell's happening in Afghanistan? We've been there for years. Where's Osama bin Laden? And what's the point of this? And then Osama bin Laden was caught in Pakistan and people were like, well, wait a minute, why are we still in Afghanistan then? No one could really answer that. And we weren't losing a lot of troops, but every year we'd lose a few by roadside bombs, and people really started to question it. And what I think then really kind of changed the whole dynamic of of the military too was Bill Clinton in 1993. He did a tolerance of homosexuals. It was don't ask, don't tell. Before the 1993, you couldn't be gay and be in the military because of historical reasons. It's just not a good thing. And he said, okay, well, as long as you don't say anything about it, as long as you remain in the closet, if you don't say that you're homosexual, we'll still let you in. And that continued until 2011 when they opened it up for homosexuals. And now they actively promote homosexuals. You see in the recruitment, they have drag queens, cross-dressers, the whole bit. That was a big change. And then another big change was in 2013, they started to put women in combat roles. And so by the 2011 time frame, this is when the military started to go very woke. And that really reduced part of the appeal of a voluntary military where you could just join up, because typically it was a way for young men, if you didn't go to college, it was a way to kind of prove yourself that you're a man, that you're willing to train hard. The Army ran their ads, be all that you can be, and it showed a bunch of guys doing kick-ass stuff, training, blowing shit up, then having a cup of coffee, you know, all before the sun rises. And that appealed to a lot of guys. You know, a lot of guys, they have that. They want to protect their homeland, their people, and they want to show they're a man. And so you got in the military was very respected. But now, because the military has gone woke, where they're really pushing now homosexuality and women in roles, even if they're not qualified, that it is starting to lose the morale. Like white guys, why do you want to join the military? Because the military now has official policies trying to eliminate white men from the military. And we're seeing a crisis of competency in the military. Just the other day, we had an F-35 incident that they couldn't find for a while because the pilot, whose name they're keeping secret, ejected for God knows what reason, and the plane just kept going until it ran out of fuel. There was nothing wrong with the plane. The pilot just freaked out and ejected. And I have a feeling, it'd be interesting to get the name of the pilot, but I have a feeling it was incompetence. The pilot shouldn't have been a pilot, but for diversity reasons, or maybe empowered women reasons, they pushed that through. And this is just one incident. I've talked to a lot of people in the military, people in former military, and without exception, they have said that the military competency has really decreased now because of all this woke stuff. So the military is no longer a cool thing to join, especially if you want to defend the nation. It's like if you're a minority and you want a jobs program, that's all it is. But the idea to fight for your country, which is like Southern white guys, they don't want to be a part of it, and for a good reason. So getting back to this whole draft again, we're no longer 1965. We're not a cohesive country. The country is basically right now in a cold civil war between itself. We have all these factions. The government officially hates white men, Christians, and so, but that's their pool that they need to be competent to fight the next war. But those guys are wising up and like, why should I fight for a country that hates me? And that's a problem. Because if you had a draft, really, do you think all these Somalis coming in are going to want to fight for the Donbass? Fuck no. Do you think all these empowered women are going to want to die somewhere in a trench in Ukraine? Fuck no. And that was always the case, but they could always count on the white guys, you know, hoorah, wave the flag in their face, and they'll do your dirty work. But those guys are wising up. They're like, why should I fight for a country that hates me? I don't see any purpose in this. So unless our territory is attacked directly, the United States, I just don't see the will that a draft would work anymore. And without a draft, we would not be able to fight Russia or China. And they're talking all this shit to Russia and China. And I'm like, if you're running your mouth, you better be willing to back it up. And if there is a draft, I would encourage white guys to avoid it, dodge it. I'll hide you on my property. And I think millions of other white people would do the same thing with their sons and daughters, say, no, don't go fight for this evil government. Why should we fight for Zelensky, a dictator that is literally throwing American journalists in jail, that prisons Christians, shutting down Christian churches? Fuck that. No, we don't want any part of this. And this is such a big change. So the change really is cultural. And people like Mike Pence, who's, "Ooh-rah, we got to stand tough and fight Russia," because Pence said he wanted to fight Russia. Well, okay, Pence, if we're going to fight Russia, we're going to need a draft, because it's not Iraq. Okay, Iraq, you could have an all-volunteer army, which, by the way, in 1993, they didn't have, when they started the 1991, when we did Desert Storm, homosexuals weren't allowed in the military. There weren't women in combat. There was still this brotherhood of arms type of thing, and people was still somewhat patriotic. The government hadn't gone full jihad against white people, and they still promoted based on competency somewhat. That has changed. That has changed. 91, let's see, 2001. 2021, that was over 20 years ago, right? 30 years ago. So it's a different era now, Mike Pence. And with China and Russia, they're not Iraq, where we could just have a couple of drone operators versus a turkey shoot, and we don't actually have to fight, where we just slaughter them. They're going to shoot back, and we're going to have a lot of troops die, and die for what? So this is an example of how a lot of conservatives, because they live in the past, and I get that. When you get older, you start to do that a little bit. You get nostalgic for better times, but that country doesn't exist. This country, I don't even know if it's majority white anymore. We're being flooded in. The demographics are changing. It's no longer Christian. It's an extremely immoral society. It's becoming a police state. It's a one-party system with censorship that has a hatred towards whites and men and Christians, and they expect in that environment to still be able to get all these guys and oorah, fight for them. I think those days are over. Talk to you guys later.